we need to talk about trans activists, because not only are they a danger to women, they are a danger to gay people, and I would contend they are also a danger to trans people themselves. Something really needs to be done about this. Their antics are just obscene and ridiculous. But before we come on to that, though you do not want to catch the cold I've somehow contracted, you do want to catch the content we put out daily on politics, current affairs and culture. To ensure you do that, make sure you hit the subscribe button and look out for more. Anyway, let's begin, shall we? So, J.K. Rowling has been doxed by trans activists. If you haven't already seen this story, as J.K. Rowling herself reported on Twitter yesterday, or that's November the 22nd for those of you who are listening back. She says, last Friday, my family's address was posted on Twitter by 3 activist actors who took pictures of themselves in front of our house, carefully positioning themselves to ensure that our address was visible. She goes on, I want to say a massive thank you to everybody who reported the image to Twitter support. Your kindness and decency made all the difference to my family and me. I'd also like to thank Police Scotland for their support and assistance. In this matter, I implore those people who retweeted the image with the address still visible, even if they did so in condemnation of these people's actions, to delete it. Over the last few years, J.K. Rowling continues, I've watched appalled as women like Alison Bailey, Raquel Sanchez, Marion Miller, Rosie Duffield, Joanna Cherry, Julie Bindel, Rosa Friedman, Kathleen Stock, and many, many others, including women who have no public profile but who contacted me to relate their experiences, have been subjected to campaigns of intimidation which range from being hounded on social media, the targeting of their employers, all the way up to doxing and direct threats of violence, including rape. None of these women are protected in the way I am. They and their families have been put into a state of fear and distress for no other reason than that they refuse to uncritically accept that the socio-political concept of gender identity should replace that of sex. I have to assume that, and she lists these Twitter accounts, thought doxing me would intimidate me out of speaking up for women's sex-based rights. They should have reflected on the fact that I've now received so many death threats, I could paper the house with them, and I haven't stopped speaking out. Perhaps, and I'm just throwing this out there, the best way to prove your movement isn't a threat to women is to stop stalking, harassing and threatening us. Well said, J.K. Rowling. Well said. As the BBC reports, as a summary of this story, she's accused 3 people who campaign on transgender matters of posting a photo of her Edinburgh address on Twitter. The author, who has been criticised for her views on trans issues, I like that the BBC has to throw this line in at the top of the piece, as though that were the most relevant thing here. Woman is doxed by trans activists, but we have to mention that she's been critical of trans activists. She's reported the matter to the police. Police Scotland said they had been made aware and inquiries were ongoing. With Police Scotland's form is any guide, so they'll be more interested in what J.K. Rowling tweets about trans people than they would about actual threats against J.K. Rowling's family, because Police Scotland is a garbage organisation in hock to the hate crime lobby. Anyway, in a now deleted social media post, one of the groups said the photo had been removed after they received threatening messages online. In her own Twitter thread, Rowling said the image depicted the 3 activists in front of her home, carefully positioning themselves to ensure the address was visible. They reiterate. And then again, the BBC inexplicably takes care to point out it's almost as though justifying it. I mean, at least the framing is such. Whether the author intended this or not, we of course can't know, not being privy to the inner workings of their mind, but it's an odd decision when someone is doxed a famous person, or rather the family of a famous person. It's an odd decision to say, yes, well, but she has said controversial things in the past. As the BBC continues here, Rowling sparked controversy in June 2020 for posting tweets which took issue with the phrase people who menstruate. She objected to the avoidance of the use of the word woman. In a lengthy blog post, the writer of the Harry Potter book said her interest in trans issues stemmed from being a survivor of abuse and having concerns around single-sex spaces. Critics said her views diminished the identity of trans people, while stars from the Harry Potter films, including Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson, distanced themselves from her comments. Well, maybe if, Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson find J.K. Rowling so utterly beyond the pale that any association with her is likewise beyond the pale, maybe they should stop accepting the royalties from the films that have made them millions, because I don't know if you've seen them in anything else, but it's not exactly as though either of these 2 people would have made a career without J.K. Rowling. I mean, can you imagine Daniel Radcliffe making it on his own merits? No, because he doesn't have any. Emma Watson, very good at 1 or 2 facial expressions, does a lot of eyebrow movement. Looked fairly nice, I guess, but an actress? Yeah, really? Can't see it myself. I actually rewatched the Harry Potter films the other day, and some of them, and I decided I would avoid the early ones because I had a vague recollection that they couldn't act when they were children. So I skipped the first 3 or 4 and went to number 5 or number 6 or whatever it was. Lo and behold, they couldn't act when they were older either. But there we are. But yes, odd of the BBC to have to point out that though this woman has been doxxed, and though her family have been doxxed, and this has severe implications given the state of trans activism in this country, they nevertheless do have to take care to point out that J.K. Rowling has said some nasty things about trans people, or rather not nasty things, but controversial things, like biological sex exists and men don't menstruate. Controversial in the 21st century, under the new doctrine of Lysenkoism we live under. The BBC continues. The author described the actions of the group, which posted the picture displaying her address as doxing, the malicious act of publishing personal information online. Rowling said she believed the activists had attempted to intimidate her out of speaking up for women's sex-based rights. She said they should have reflected on the fact. We've covered this already. A Police Scotland spokesperson said, "We are aware of this incident and police inquiries are ongoing. One of the people who was involved wrote on Facebook, yesterday we posted a picture we took at J.K. Rowling's house. The post, which has now been deleted, added, while we stand by the photo, since posting it we have received an overwhelming amount of serious and threatening transphobic messages, so we've decided to take the photo down." So, receiving threatening messages is a bad thing, obviously. And if it is the case that these people have received threatening messages, that should be condemned and deplored. But then they should also be condemned and deplored by the fact that they've just posted J.K. Rowling's address online. What messages do you think she's receiving? What messages do you think her family are receiving? Maybe you should, if an action which causes threatening messages to be sent or received is ipso facto bad, then maybe you shouldn't have posted the damn photo in the first place. Idiots. Before we move on to more serious matters, I thought, because, Owen Jones, the Guardian columnist, never fails to inject the dickhead into any conversation about trans rights, you should be opining on, any story to do with trans in the news. So I thought, just, did he say anything about this? Because he says, he never normally shuts up. He says everything about everything else. Has he commented at any point about what these people have done, given that it mentions the word trans in the headline, and I think he has some kind of Twitter filter set up to ensure that he comments on all of these things? Has he said anything? Well, he's going to an LGBTQ charity event in Brighton on Thursday, and he's looking forward to that. Doesn't very much like Boris Johnson, which we knew. Some polling data that's come out. The Tory Health and Care Bill, no. Actually, no, don't really seem to find anything here from Owen Jones. Doesn't like Margaret Thatcher. Doesn't like the Conservative Party's social care plan. Some Tory councillors been knocked for being angry to Jeremy Corbyn. Oh, no, there seems to be, from a man who never shuts up on the subject of trans people, no comment at all that I can find. Has he said anything here? Nope. Still no. Alan Partridge there, nope. Boris, nope. So, Owen Jones unusually silent. Now, usually what Owen Jones can be relied upon to say in these issues is that his usual stock response to any issue of cancel culture or anybody who's been done in for not accepting the idea that men can menstruate and women can have penises. Normally he'll say of people like Julie Bindel, for instance, well, of course they haven't been cancelled because they got book deals, because they have the support of publishers, they have columns they can write, which is a quisling response, and of course it completely misses the point. But it's also not entirely true in the case of J.K. Rowling, as NPR reports various different organisations are distancing themselves from J.K. Rowling. The cast of Harry Potter has reunited, but without her, which is an odd decision to make, given that she created the damn thing. Thankfully, I didn't watch this because I have a life. Thankfully, I think it was just a retrospective. Yes, and as NPR here reports, the cast and crew of the movies will be returning for a look back on the franchise. But one person you shouldn't count on seeing is author J.K. Rowling. At least they didn't try and do some kind of actual episode or a short film. Those are always tragic. I'm thinking of the Parks and Recreation reunion that happened via Zoom or whatever it was during the lockdown. But it would be really odd now as well, because if you actually tried to put Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson and the ginger one, what's his name? Don't remember. If you tried to put them back in character, what would you get? I mean, Harry is now a chain-smoking alcoholic, and Emma Watson's some kind of frigid accountant, and the ginger one is unemployed. So at least they didn't try and do that. It's just a retrospective. But again, J.K. Rowling is not there. Director Christopher Columbus, who surprisingly hasn't been cancelled, who directed the first 2 Potter films, Daniel Radcliffe, Emma Watson, Rupert Grint, that's his name, And other actors from the 8 films will gather for a journey back to Hogwarts to discuss the making of Harry Potter and the impact of the franchise, according to HBO Max. This will be the first time they've reunited for such a project since the final film premiered in 2011, the streaming service said. However, while Rowling will be featured in archived footage, she will not be appearing for the special, a source close to the production confirmed to NPR. They did not comment on why Rowling will not appear, or whether she was asked to participate and declined. Rowling has in recent years been the subject of controversy. Again, NPR feels the need to insert this where it doesn't really belong. In 2019, she drew condemnation for her tweets in support of Maya Forstadt, a researcher whose transphobic statements, which weren't biological sex is not transphobic. And if you say that it is, then you're living in fantasy land. It ought to be possible to support transgender people whilst also believing that science is a thing. Anyway, a researcher whose transphobic statements, which weren't, cost her job, though that decision was later successfully appealed. Rowling went on to defend her support of Forstadt in an essay about gender, and in which she said that she'd been sexually abused, and we immediately went from believe all women to, yeah, but not this one, or, well, who cares, or it doesn't matter, or it doesn't excuse the fact that she's said nasty things about trans people by reaffirming basic biological fact. And her comments had divided the fanbase and alienated many readers. Well, that's true if they say it is. Following Rowling's comments, several actors from the Potter film spoke out in defense of trans people and to denounce Rowling's actions. Radcliffe did so in an essay of his own. Watson shared her support for trans people on Twitter, which I'm sure made them all feel a lot better. And Grint spoke out in the UK's Sunday Times and later in an interview with Esquire. Rowling's tweets have continued to stir controversy last year. Her apparent mockery of gender-inclusive language used by a media outlet garnered more backlash. That gender-inclusive language was, again, people who menstruate as opposed to women. Other forms of this art include pregnant people as opposed to women. Breast-adorned people as opposed to women. Vagina possessors as opposed to women. There's not really the equivalent attempt to erase men. Occasional birthing people, again, I think that's another one. But men sort of get away with this. It is always against women that this seems to be carried out, this piece of Orwellian language rejigging, which is a point J.K. Rowling herself made. Anyway, NPR likewise feels it necessary, as the BBC did, to point out that J.K. Rowling is believes in biology, and this is widely speculated upon in the press as the reason that J.K. Rowling was not invited herself to the retrospective. Why that should be not allowed, but her archival footage should be, when she's presumably always thought this, I don't know. But, that is it, apparently. So, the idea that J.K. Rowling is immune to cancellation, to an extent that's true. She's already made her millions, and people, whatever articles like this say about it dividing the fan base, that's not really true either. It might have carved off a tiny fraction of idiots who make up the trans activist movement, but compared to J.K. Rowling's wider readership, not sure. Also, she goes under a male pen name, so I'm surprised these people don't actually hold her up as an example of self-ID. Seems to have escaped them. But anyway, this is not to stop other people attempting to do what damage they can to her reputation. She's fortunate that she is in a position, and she's said this herself many times, she has a public profile. She's already made an awful lot of money. Nobody can really take that away from her. So she's incredibly lucky. Other people aren't, and that's where the real burden of cancel culture falls. People like J.K. Rowling speaking up knowing that their reputations will take a hit, but principally because if they achieve anything, it will be hopefully at least to protect people much less fortunate than themselves from the very real threat of witch hunts, purges, and cancellation. But the retrospective isn't the only example of institutions turning against J.K. Rowling, as the Daily Mail here reports. Don't give me an advert. Snarky staff at New York City Union Square Barnes & Noble, which is their publisher, have a dig at J.K. Rowling with a display of unproblematic wizarding books after the Harry Potter author's comments about the trans community. The Mail reports that Barnes & Noble in New York City's Union Square took a chance. Why are you repeating the headline in the subheading? The display, which has been up since early November, promoted authors of other magical works because of Rowling's comments against trans people. It comes as 3 trans activists took photos of themselves in front of Rowling's Edinburgh home on Friday, with signs calling out the authors. I think, again, that there is a severe irony deficit on this part of the left, if not the left in general, certainly this part of the left. I'm just about old enough to remember when everyone mocked the biblical nutters in the United States and the Deep South, and Roman Catholic sort of fundamentalist types who tried to have Harry Potter banned, or said that their congregation certainly weren't allowed to read it, said that it promoted everything from Satanism to witchcraft, in a book about witches, to, I think, bestiality was mentioned. All kinds of wild accusations thrown out by the religious right, and everybody at the time mocked them for it, because, quite obviously, Harry Potter is not promoting Satanism. But the irony that's escaping these people is that now it's good and progressive to adopt a line once taken by religious fundamentalists, which just gives the impression, shocking I know, that parts of the trans activist movement are a religious cult and fanatics and book burners. Not sure that's a reputation they should be proud to have. Nevertheless, they seem to be proud to have it. They shouldn't be. But no, this is more, as I said, or intimated at least already, this is about more than just J.K. Rowling, of course, because the trans activist movement has for a long time been expanding its blacklist of people who must be expunged from polite society, whether peacefully or, in some cases, forcefully. This is much more than just J.K. Rowling. She reeled off a list of names herself. If we go to Unheard here, as Julie Bindel writes about the misogyny of trans activists, she is giving an account here, I think, of an event she attended. If you are seeing that image and the language offends you, sorry, but the trans activist movement is best. So she writes of this event, it was a 1,000-strong gathering of women of all ages and viewpoints, united by a desire and a commitment to ending male violence, oppression, and domination of women and girls. Everyone there is interested in dipping their toes in the water of the women's liberation movement, she writes. A big focus is the campaign to end rape, domestic abuse, commercial sexual exploitation, and femicide, the killing of women and girls by men because they are women and girls. You can actually debate this point. I mean, I don't really want to get into it at this stage. It is absolutely true that the vast majority of murders are committed by men, the vast majority of domestic violence is committed by men, and by definition, given that the vast majority of couples are heterosexual, the vast majority of victims of it are women. Whether you can leap from that and say that they are killed because they are women, in other words, their womanness is the thing that is motivating male violence, I think is a debatable point, but not one we're going to cover here. Anyway, Julie Bindel continues, as I approach the Guildhall where the conference is taking place, I hear the now only too familiar chants by trans activists. Trans women are women, no turfs on Pompey. One sign reads, imagine calling yourself a feminist while trying to dismantle the rights of a marginalized group of women and girls. The protesters are talking about a subset of men and boys who identify as transgender. During my session on the themes in my book on feminism, trans activists positioned themselves directly outside the windows and attempted to drown out my words with blowjobs are real jobs. They also object to any critique of the sex trade, which is odd, as we'll come on to. They don't very much like the fact that in some parts of the world, trans people suffer a much higher murder rate, and the vast majority of those murders take place in the sex trade. Nevertheless, sex work is real work. Amnesty, whose work is supposed to empower and protect people, was also sponsoring these aggressively anti-female protests, Bindel writes, as could be seen from the placards plastered with their logo. She says afterwards she approached some of the activists to ask whether they could engage in a respectful dialogue. She said it would be better than being at war with each other and that the feminists inside the building were no danger or threat to them whatsoever. They told me, she says, barely able to look me in the eye, that when feminists talk about single-sex spaces such as prisons and refuges, that this leads to transphobic bigotry, which in turn leads to trans people being murdered. Now, we're going to come on presently, and I hope shortly, to this question of the trans murder rate. I think everybody is familiar with the claims. Trans people are the most oppressed, the most victimized. They have a disproportionately high suicidality rate, disproportionately the target of murderers and thugs. They're beaten up, all the rest of it. Actually, this is true, not true. None of it is true. Not in this country, not in the West broadly, not in America even, which has a generally higher murder rate. But as I say, we'll come on to that. Bindel continues, a female journalist she knew came in to join the conversation, suggesting that the signs being held up by some of the comrades telling the conference attendees to suck my dick, you transphobic C-words, was not acceptable, and certainly not suggestive of an oppressed group protesting their oppressor. It looked rather more like plain old-fashioned misogyny. They said something along the lines of, that's how young people talk these days. I told them, Bindel says, that the last time I was attacked by a man, he punched me in the face when I told him to sod off, the last words I heard before being knocked out cold was, suck my dick, you C-word. She says they continue trying to engage, but as they heard in the session, feminist fight back beyond gender wars in the academy, with Professor Silena Todd and Joe Phoenix. Students are currently being given permission to trot out mantras and adopt Orwellian opinions as opposed to engage in critical thinking. So in other words, her attempts at Engaging with trans activists led predictably to a failure on the part of trans activists to engage, and instead to behaviour which Bindle contends, and many other people contend, is much more redolent of old-fashioned misogyny than it is of any kind of liberationist movement. That's a general problem, which is faced by people all around the world, particularly by women. Joanna Williams in The Telegraph writes much sort of similar story to that of Julie Bendel's, recounting some more of these stories. Stories of women being subjected to abuse from extreme trans activists no longer have the power to shock, she says. We've grown used to gender-critical academics having urine thrown at their office doors, or needing bodyguards to accompany them to lectures simply for defending women's sex-based rights. We watched as Kathleen Stock was handed out of her professorship at the University of Sussex, and that, in turn, after a long and sordid campaign of bullying and intimidation by the supposed oppressed minority group. J.K. Rowling is mentioned here, and as we've already covered, she's been facing abuse. She's been doxed, and she's been excised from her own franchise. Learning someone wants to kill you is horrific, Joanna Williams says. Online threats are often anonymous and can with effort be rationalized away, but when your address is made public, death threats become terrifyingly real. Suddenly, it's not just you being targeted, but your family, the people you love and want to protect. So J.K. Rowling, as we've said, has spoken of being appalled. She watched other people, Marion Miller, Rosie Duffield, Joanna Cherry, and others, face this kind of extreme intimidation from the trans activist movement. And she's right. As the article continues, a hardcore fringe of trans activists are waging a scurrilous campaign of intimidation and abuse designed to frighten women into submission. They want to silence critics and will, it seems, stop at nothing to make women shut up. Rarely has free speech been so explicitly threatened, and here you ought to go and support the Free Speech Union, which does a lot of work in this field, Spiked as well, which publishes a lot of articles in this area. We'll come on to a few more different articles from a few different outlets. There are people out there willing to speak up for this, and increasing numbers of them as well. We went through this awful period where it was sort of the onslaught of the woke, where nobody really quite knew how to react. They were already an organised movement. They managed to capture, via diversity and inclusion boards in major companies, the entire corporate ecosystem, and it became almost the default position of corporations, of press outlets, of universities to say, well, this organised group of people are very loud, therefore they must represent the majority. Meanwhile, their opponents, who are largely the ones being abused and threatened and intimidated and subsequently sacked for their views on, for instance, the objectivity of biological science, they were not equivalently organised, and by not being organised, they suffered from isolation. As Benjamin Franklin said, we must all hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately. That's now changing now, as we see more articles like this and more public figures like J.K. Rowling being willing to speak up, and that's a good thing, but it's got a long way to go. There's a lot of damage left to undo, and the fight does continue. We on this side are doing the fight by words, by the conflicts of ideas. Too often, in the case of the trans activist movement, the fight is more physical. The fight involves fists. The fight involves literal fighting. Although when only one side is party to the fighting, it's more beating up than fighting. Women are much less inclined to punch back than men are, even if the men are dressed as women. Rowling is fortunate that her books give her an independent source of income. Well, we've covered all this. But most women are not that lucky, so it's hardly surprising that in the face of such intimidation, many women choose to remain silent even when their rights are being eroded and the safety of vulnerable women may be at risk. And as silence is by definition unquantifiable, we do not know how many people feel unable to speak freely about sex and gender, says Joanna Williams. The recent celebrations of the 20th anniversary of the Harry Potter film franchise have shown that J.K. Rowling risks being written out of her own famous creation. A London school has dropped Rowling as a house name, and this is a terrible pity. Rowling's fortitude, bravery, and dignity make her the perfect role model for children. Her refusal to be silenced offers a lesson to us all in how to respond to censorious, abusive, woke mobs. If we move on, you have to bear with her. Of course, we all know, we should at least by now all know the story of Kathleen Stock, who was finally took the decision to resign from the University of Sussex, although it would be probably more accurate to say that she was forced out, given the campaign of intimidation and bullying that was waged against her by trans activists, disgracefully backed by they belatedly apologised for this, but for a long time tolerated by the university and disgracefully backed by the University and College Union, which is supposed to stand up for its members against precisely this kind of treatment. So Kathleen Stock has resigned. She now again, thankfully, has a profile just about sufficient to sustain her, and she is now willing to speak out about this. She was before. She required security as she walked around on campus. She says she has no regrets over quitting the post, but said she'd endured low-level bullying and reputation trashing at the hands of staff, which is again another aspect of this insidious woke creep, because it's not just activists on the outside of organisations, it's staff on the inside of organisations who've been captured by this mind virus, and the presence of so many diversity and inclusion teams, diversity and inclusion officers at major institutions, which really operate in the form of commissars set up by the Soviet Union, which in turn operated much like the Spanish Inquisition. But in the Soviet Union in its particularly paranoid stage, used to place ideological officers in scientific labs during the Lysenkoist era, in any major public institution, in order to ensure that everybody towed the party line, that there were no heretics present, that nobody blasphemed against the party line, that they remained ideologically pure. And actually diversity and inclusion officers, which earn a staggering amount of money and in place in a staggering number of institutions, perform much the same role. In my real life as a journalist, I've come a crop of these people occasionally who will write in to complain about things which are so innocuous, and that they have no prior relationship with you. They don't take the time to consider whether you're joking. They don't take the time to consider the points that you're making. No, they will write, and they won't write to you. They will write above you. They will go directly to the boss. They will go directly to the person who is in charge of complaints. They will go as far up as the companies they think they can get away with, in order to bypass reasoned discussion, in order to bypass the very possibility that the person they're complaining about might have a justified reason for saying what they've said. These people are everywhere, and these are the kind of people who would have been responsible for bullying Kathleen Stock, though they're by no means the only type of person. As the Mail reports, she went on to say she was ostracised while working at the university and faced a terrible anxiety dream seeing her name plastered on posters across campus. Stock said she still holds the view that trans women aren't women and trans men aren't men, but said they're compatible with protecting trans people. Now they are. They objectively are compatible with protecting trans people. You can hold to the view that people have the right to change gender. You can even hold to that view whilst doubting the validity of the concept of gender. But you can by and large accept the rights of people to live a life that they choose to live. The basic demand, which is akin to the one made by the gay rights movement of the 1960s, which is that other people have no say in what I do in my private life. But the key to that word is private life. It's a demand to be left alone, which the trans movement, the trans activist movement, goes well beyond. It doesn't just want the right to be left alone to act in private in the way it wants to act in private. It demands public recognition. And that's something very different. That's more akin to the modern gay movement to attempt to compel, for instance, the legitimation of gay marriage on religious institutions which are theologically opposed to this. Now, full disclosure, I am not straight. I stand to benefit from some of these reforms, should I ever wish to get married to somebody of my own sex, but I still don't believe it's the right of myself to demand. Well, I can demand if I want to, but I don't think I should. But it's not my right to compel other people to accept what I say about myself. That's very, very different. The right to be left alone by other people is not the right to tell them what they must think or believe. Now, Kathleen Stock is right to say that the belief that trans women aren't women is compatible with protecting trans people. I know trans people. I'm friends with trans people. I admire, like, and respect trans people. Genuine trans people who really do have a difficult time of things and who've made the really difficult choice and gone through the very difficult, because it is an incredibly difficult process to actually properly, fully transition. We are still just about maintaining the barriers to children making those decisions, for instance, and then regretting it in later life. At present, or it certainly has been the case up until recent history, when the move has been to relax these standards, trans people have a really difficult job to go through. And that's an understatement. I mean, it's not a decision you make lightly. It's not a lifestyle choice. Some trans people, I don't think a majority of modern trans people, but there are some genuine trans people who believe that they are born in the wrong sex, the wrong gender. They want to change that, and they will go to the lengths required to do that. They will live as another person. They will go through the process. It's not a pleasant process, actually going through the physical, the kinetic aspect of transitioning. That's difficult, and it's not something you choose lightly, which is why I would contend it should remain difficult. We ought to keep standards in place, difficult though it is for trans people who might have wished subsequently that they had an easier time of it. We risk doing much more damage by lowering those standards. But I can like, respect and admire these people and want them to live happy and fulfilled lives in the manner that they so choose, without abandoning my belief in the basic mammalian fact of sexual dimorphism and the fact that categories of male and female are biologically valid. Not just valid, but true. These two things are not in conflict, but the trans activist movement insists that they are, because even the slightest deviation from their totalitarian worldview is presented by them as heresy, as blasphemy. This is why they react so violently against it. So by repeating something as basic, Professor Sir Robert Winston on Question Time quite recently said, you cannot change your sex. Part of that is in the clue in the name transgender. We moved away from transsexual when the gender ideology took off. But he made a basic point of biological fact, and Fiona Bruce, the Question Time host, took pains to say, well, there are lots of people who would vehemently disagree with you. Okay, journalist, you're telling a professor of biology with a long and storied career that other people disagree with him on a point of basic fact about sex and the mammalian species, a mammalian ubiquity, if you will. Okay, I'm sure some people do disagree with him, but, some people disagree that the Holocaust happened. The fact that people disagree with you is not evidence that... the BBC does not accept this in the context of climate change, for instance. Some people disagree that humans cause climate change. Some people disagree that climate change is happening at all. Some people say that vaccines cause autism. But the BBC does not give these people equal time. It doesn't say, whenever a climate scientist says, it's established fact that climate change is happening, it doesn't say, well, there are people who disagree with you and we have to point that out. No. Well, it's got to be one rule for... It can't be one rule for one and not the rest in this case. But it's a sign of the fear that is gripping institutions as a result of the trans activist movement that Fiona Bruce is, in that Question Time episode, compelled to say to a biologist that people disagree with him, people who are not themselves biologists, people who by and large exist only on Twitter, that they disagree with him on points of basic mammalian physiology. Nevertheless, she felt compelled to do that because the BBC is institutionally afraid of this kind of thing, as most institutions in the country still are. Moving on from there. Kathleen Stugg. This has been going on a little bit longer. It actually has affected people on the left as well. J.K. Rowling is on the left, for God's sake. She's not hard left, but she's always espoused, to the extent she's invaded on politics at all, which is admirably little, thankfully little. But, she's basically soft left. But, Len Mccluskey here, he was... at the time, when this was written, I think in 2019, the head of Unite, which is, I think, the largest trade union in the country. He signed a letter accusing trans rights activists of intimidation, as the Guardian reported at the time. 2018, I stand corrected. Britain's most powerful union leader, the Guardian reported, has joined a group of feminist campaigners to sign a controversial letter that accuses some transgender rights activists of violent and intimidating behaviour. The Unite General Secretary Len Mccluskey was one of about 140 people, including Julie Bindel and Ruth Savotka, who signed a letter in the Morning Star. What? The head of the largest trade union in the country writes for communist newspapers? Well, colour me shocked. Anyway, the letter warned that a handful of recent episodes risk drawing the whole of our progressive movement into disrepute, and he was absolutely right. This is the only time probably you'll ever hear me agreeing with Len Mccluskey on anything, because the man was cancer, and it would be lucky if the news that he's no longer head of Unite, we might consider ourselves lucky, except that he's been replaced by somebody who's really not very much better. Anybody who thinks the trade union movement in this country is a force for good in the world, and rather than just a cabal of radical leftists with a stranglehold on the opposition party is living in dreamland. Anyway, the letter highlighted a series of recent incidents, including the conviction of Tara Wood, 26, in April, for the assault of Maria McLaughlin, a 60-year-old woman who had gathered with others in order to attend a meeting to discuss the potential impact on women and girls. Changes to the Gender Recognition Act, because again, this is a problem which we must address with the trans activist movement. And I am deliberately including the word activist here, because it's not the trans people generally, it's the trans activist movement. I would be surprised if the majority of the trans activist movement was trans. I'd be surprised if a plurality of them were trans. I suspect the actual number of real trans people in the transgender activist movement are not trans themselves. Or rather, sorry, the vast majority of trans activists are not transgender. It will be a very small minority of people in there who are in fact transgender, is the impression one gets when one reads them on Twitter or one sees them go to protest. But we have to acknowledge this problem. It has been present over and over again, and unfortunately it's because you can't change certain biological facts. For instance, the male propensity to violence, which is why when old women gather to debate the potential impact on women and girls of the Gender Recognition Act, this attempt to impose self-ID, effectively allowing people, just by saying that they want to be a woman that day, to enter spaces specifically set aside and created for women to be safe from men. These old women were debating this idea, discussing the idea amongst themselves, and one of them, a 60-year-old, was punched in the face by, I believe, a trans person. Maria McLaughlin. Well, yes, it would be a trans person. Feminists have always said that, and Judy Bindel said earlier, that there is a real problem with male violence against women. This idea that you can just change that on a piece of paper and therefore that propensity disappears is just nonsense. It's self-evident nonsense, which is why, unfortunately, you tend to get more violence from trans women than you do from biological women, because trans women retain certain aspects, certain of the less pleasant aspects of their inferior origin, I suppose feminists would say, of their maleness. We actually saw, I think in Sweden, the study was done, which showed that after a passage of something akin to the gender ID law, rates of domestic abuse, rates of violent crime, rates of battery, for instance, soared amongst women. And then they looked into the data and discovered that it just happened to coincide with a period where men were allowed to declare themselves as women, which is an admirable attempt at statistical equality, but I'm not sure it's quite what the trans movement had in mind. The Guardian continued at the time. The letter signed by McCluskey, along with a lot of other lefties, also described a confrontation on a Beck 2 union picket line in March, saying that trans activists with no connection to the industrial dispute itself mobbed and verbally attacked a female trade union member on the basis of having recognised her as an attendee at a similar meeting. McCluskey, however, being a coward, started to row back on this at the time. He initially said he'd signed the letter to improve the climate of debate around proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act, which is incredibly naive because the trans activist movement rejects the very concept of debate. I mean, that's one of their slogans, is trans people are not a debate, or trans lives are not a debate? They refuse to debate. Words of violence, don't you know, Mr. McCluskey? Many of your allies think the same thing. Anyway, he immediately faced criticism for signing a document that appeared to make little reference to transgender rights. Laura Murray, the head of external relations in the office of Jeremy Corbyn, tweeted, "I'm apparently disgusting and not a feminist or a socialist because I stand against transphobia, but according to today's letter in the Morning Star, all abusive behaviour in this debate comes from the trans activists." Jesus, well, I haven't read the letter. Maybe that is the implication. I don't think anybody sensible would make that claim, but the vast, vast majority of it comes from trans activists. I don't think you get J.K. Rowling going around doxing trans activists, for instance. You don't tend to get 60-year-old women punching trans women. It tends to be the other way around, in my experience. Anyway, Len Mccluskey, being a snivelling little coward, clarified his position, tweeting, "I oppose all hate crime, including against trans people," and said that Unite, whose policy conference is going on in Brighton, had agreed a more conciliatory executive statement that asserted, "We oppose division between our women's movement and our lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans movement. Our campaigns to tackle discrimination are inclusive and member-led," which is a very long-worded way of saying nothing. It's like when people try and point out that anti-Semitism is a problem, and the likes of Jeremy Corbyn say, "I oppose all forms of discrimination." But when you tell him that Islamophobia is a problem, then he will specifically mention Islamophobia. The trans movement benefits from exactly the same thing. Criticise the trans movement, or if somebody dares say something untoward about the trans movement that they perhaps didn't recognise the full implications of, they'll come out and say, "No, but of course we oppose all forms of discrimination. All forms of discrimination are bad. Never mind discrimination against women specifically. No, all forms of discrimination are bad." Now, we've covered some of the tactics used by the trans movement, the aggressive, violent, in some cases, generally speaking, nasty and disreputable tactics used by trans activists. They might argue that trans people face an extreme set of circumstances, extreme discrimination, they are extremely oppressed, therefore, these kinds of drastic actions are essential. They have no choice but to do this because they are so violently oppressed by people. They will often cite statistics, for instance, showing that trans people are murdered more often than anybody else. They face more discrimination than anybody else, especially if they're black for some reason. Black trans people, which must make up about 0.0002% of the UK population, is apparently the most oppressed group in the country. And they will make hay to point this out. Cliches, again, will come out when I'm ill. So that's the claim that's made. So perhaps this is true. Maybe let's assume that it's... Well, no, let's not assume that it's true. Let's interrogate the data, shall we? Is it true that trans people are uniquely oppressed? Is it true that they are uniquely targeted by violence and discrimination? Let's have a look. So, this is the kind of thing that you'll hear from them, from their activists, from their lackeys in the press who don't bother to critique this stuff. So PBS reports earlier this month, in November the 9th, that 2021 is now the deadliest year on record for transgender people. The list of names is now longer than it's ever been, they report. With nearly 2 months left, 2021 has shattered the record of transgender homicides in a year, with 45 to date. most of them black or Latinx, according to the Human Rights Campaign. Last year held the previous record with 44 trans murders. Markeisha Lawrence, a 28-year-old black transgender woman in South Carolina, was killed on November the 4th. In a statement, Tori Cooper, Director of Community Engagement for the Transgender Justice Initiative for HRC, called Lawrence's death a tragic milestone for her and for a community that deeply loved her. We must commit to honouring trans lives and ending the horrific epidemic of violence that plagues our community, Cooper said. Markeisha deserved nothing less than our full commitment to building a better future for trans people. PBS continues. The transgender writer and activist Raquel Willis called the news demoralising and expected, given the lack of investment in trans communities of colour. What? The lack of investment in trans communities of colour in recent years. I think there have been some consistent failures at addressing transgender people in the system of oppression we are constantly facing, Willis said. Overwhelmingly, the leadership of our largest LGBTQ pride organisations are not black and brown trans women or people in particular, and overwhelmingly are not addressing our needs, because black and brown trans women can only be properly represented by other black and brown trans women, which, given how few of them there are, would probably mean they all have to represent themselves, which is a nice idea, because it would mean we would do away with stupid LGBTQ pride organisations. Anyway, 4 more black trans people were killed this year than last year, per HRC data. In a tweet Tuesday night, White House Principal Deputy Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre called the killings unacceptable, etc. David Johns, Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition, said that providing financial support to black trans women and decriminalising sex work, which many trans women must turn to when denied other forms of employment, is an important part of addressing the underlying inequalities that leave trans women of colour vulnerable to violence. Okay, I'm going to preempt something we are going to come on to discuss at slightly greater length shortly. Sex work is a very dangerous occupation. Sex workers have a much higher rate of murder, for instance, or violence perpetrated against them than other forms of work, which we might call legitimate forms of work. If you want to have fewer trans people being murdered, maybe don't encourage them into a profession where more people are murdered on average. That seems to me a basic point of fact. Wouldn't that be a good idea? It's like saying to avoid getting cancer, you should move closer to Chernobyl. This is just bollocks. Anyway, so this is the kind of thing that is said, however. Plethora of grifting organisations making spurious claims about epidemics of violence faced by trans people. Is it true? Is it true that trans people are facing an epidemic of violence? Well, if we move back to the United Kingdom, Channel 4 News attempted to fact-check this. So we're moving slightly away from the United States, so we'll come back to that in short order. But how many trans people in the UK are murdered, for instance? Because we've seen time and time again, we have people repeating the claims from, actually I think I've got this open here, Trans Day of Remembrance. So some of these will be American. We are transitioning back to the UK to coin a phrase. The State of New York says, we remember those in the transgender community who've lost to acts of violence. Hate of any kind, there's no place in New York, we'll always stand against it. Transgender Day of Remembrance, to always remember those who have unjustly suffered and suffer for the most natural and sacred of aspirations, to be oneself. To always remember the gender identity as a fundamental right of every person. Those who believe in justice every day march with their ideals for a battle of civilization. Not at all dramatic. Scottish Rail. Why does Scottish Rail have an opinion on this? Do its train conductors go about murdering trans people? Are trans people murdered often on the Scottish Rail trains? Why does Scottish Rail get up? What? Why? David Starkey, I think, made this point in a SDP conference. Why do organisations have these values? It's not the place of organisations to. What is Scottish Rail's opinion on Trans Day of Remembrance? What is the... Why? Anyway, Scottish Rail says, we're reaffirming our commitment to ensuring that Scotland's railway is for everyone. Because I suppose at the moment, are trans people prohibited from getting on trains? Do they stop you and look up your kilt and see what you've got? Maybe that's what they do. It is Scotland. Strange things happen there, but I wasn't aware that this was going on. Whether you're a passenger or a member of staff, you can be assured that we will not tolerate intolerance. So you will. Popper's paradox of tolerance is bollocks. If you won't tolerate intolerance, you are being intolerant, and especially if you're defining intolerance so broadly, as I'm sure Scottish Rail does, because it wants to be seen to be on course with this. But ScotRail, I don't think, is a really sort of a deep thinking philosophical organisation that understands the meaning of intolerance in common parlance, how that may have been expanded. From everyone, Corey Bush, it's the deadliest year on record for trans people. Go on. I mean, I don't even know what Pop Crave is, but it's citing the numbers. 3 UK. I mean, mobile phone companies have to get involved with this as well. I don't know, actually, is this even to do with it? Is it just, it's just a promoted advert? I'm sure they did put out some kind of statement. Blue ticks, yep, Trans Day of Remembrance. Scott Rail again. Scott Rail is very keen on this. To save any more if you're asking, our support of transgender people has no impact on trains running on time, but thank you for your concern. Scotland's railway is for everyone, and it always will be. You might have more trains if you didn't take them all out of commission to paint stupid rainbow flags on them. Maybe you should. I think the point people were making there is that you should put more of your money, time, and your effort into making trains run on time. The SNP doesn't handle railways any better than the Westminster government does, despite what they might try and tell you, and a bit less time just gesticulating on Twitter about Trans Day of Remembrance. By the way, I don't think a single trans person in Scotland has been murdered in something like the last 5 years. Again, on to which we're coming. It goes on. Nancy Pelosi, other blue ticks on Twitter, the Trevor Project, whatever the hell that is. Elizabeth Warren, someone who knows all about at least attempting to transition, if failing to transition. Her attempt to be transracial didn't go particularly well. Also, always giving the impression here that the trans movement, J.K. Rowling, with a stegosaurus on the pride flag for some reason, the trans movement is more concerned with political opponents than it is with itself. Heaven forfend people get that impression. The Vagina Museum, today is Trans Day of Remembrance. Do you think the Vagina Museum might know a little bit about, the tendency for vaginas to belong to one sex and not the other? I think the Vagina Museum, surely, of any institution in the world, the Vagina Museum should be able to point this out. The National Archives, which has somehow found a cross-dresser from way back when, I vaguely recall, a time when it was deemed offensive when you associated cross-dressing people with transgender people. I thought we weren't supposed to do that. Pete Buttigieg, whoever that person is, it goes on. Mermaids, toxic organisation attempting to give puberty blockers to children. Stay well clear of them. And it goes on and on and on. Anyway, back to where we were. Channel 4 News attempted to fact-check the question. How many trans people are murdered in the UK? Is there an epidemic of violence against trans people in the UK? Because if there is, it would be borne out, for instance, in murder statistics. As it reported on the 23rd of November 2018. So this is going back to the year before, but this has not, in fact, changed since. There hasn't suddenly been a jump in the subsequent 3 or 4 years. Anyway, and the claims, tellingly, were being made then as well. Every year. It's like NHS privatisation. Every year is the worst year for them. How many trans people are there in the UK? The latest government publication on the topic, which acknowledged there is no robust data, tentatively estimates between 200,000 and 500,000 trans people in the UK, includes 4,910 people who have been given legal recognition of their change of sex in the form of a gender recognition certificate, as well as those who self-identify as transgender, which is a very low number. That will have increased over time, given how much more popular it's become. Because for some people it is a lifestyle choice, and that's what happens when you remove barriers to entry. Genuine transgender people who actually go through the process of making the physical change put up with an awful lot of shit. And I'm not going to speak for them, but if I were to try and imagine myself in their shoes, I would be incredibly annoyed at these sort of fair weather trans people who decide that they're gender non-conforming, gender non-binary, that they can decide on a whim whether they are a woman on a Wednesday and a man on a Monday. I think I would be offended by this suggestion, the attempt to conflate genuine trans people with these fashionistas, which is what they essentially are. Channel 4 News admits it will have to use unofficial figures. For the purposes of the article, it said we'll use stats from the trans rights organisation, Trans Respect versus Transphobia Worldwide. Perfectly impartial source taken from by Channel 4 News there. Any reason they might have picked that organisation? Like any major bias concerns that might have arisen in the writing of this article? So keep this in mind, however, because they are deliberately taking numbers from an organisation with a vested interest in inflating those numbers, which makes the subsequent revelations kind of interesting. It does try and get away with it. The latest Trans Respect report says there were 369 reported murders of trans and gender diverse people between the 1st of October 2017 and 30th of September 2018 around the world. 369 in the world, with a population of, at that time, approaching 7 billion people. An organisation which is much more likely to inflate the numbers than to deflate them says there were 369 reported murders of trans and gender diverse people out of a population in the world of 7 billion. Nearly half of those took place in Brazil, 167. A further 28 were recorded in the United States. Population of, taxing my memory, I'm going to say 300 million. Could be wrong. It's in the hundreds of millions, though. 28. This isn't an issue, is it, guys? Really? 28 in population of hundreds of millions? 369 out of 7 billion? Channel 4's fact check continues. According to these figures, there was one trans person murdered in the UK in that time. I shouldn't laugh, because even one is one too many. But when you compare it to the claims that are being made about epidemics of violence and murder, a total of 9 trans people were murdered in the UK between 2008 and 2017. Roughly speaking, one a year? Yeah, one victim a year, Channel 4 says. A back-of-the-envelope calculation based on this data would suggest that the average trans person has a 1 in 200,000 to 1 in 500,000 chance of being murdered in the UK over the course of the year. And I can imagine the people at Channel 4 weren't very happy when they looked into this data, because, as it continues, figures from the ONS from 2008 to 2017 show the average adult in England and Wales has a 1 in 100,000 chance of being murdered in a given year. So the epidemic of violence that trans people uniquely face has produced for them a lower chance of being murdered than the general population of the country. How is... really? An epidemic of violence? It's actually safer to be trans. How? But I'm sure everyone has heard this claim repeated. Not just by activists, but on the press from politicians as well. I'm sure everyone has heard this claim. But trans people are less likely to be murdered than your average run-of-the-mill person. It's safer to be a trans person than a non-trans person. This is more than just parallel worlds. This is multi-dimensional stuff. They're living in an opposite universe, where things that are false are true, where men can be women and women can be men, and by being safer you're more at risk, and by being more at risk you are safer. What about violence faced by trans people? Channel 4 carries on. According to the latest Home Office figures, police recorded 1,651 hate crime offences against trans people in England and Wales in 2017 and 18. 9% of those involved violence against the person with injury, and a further 24% involved violence against the person without injury. On that basis, we calculate that the police recorded 545 violent hate crime incidents against trans people in England and Wales in 2017-18. Of those, 149 resulted in injury. But the true extent is likely to be greater, according to Stonewall. Of course, because Stonewall needs money. Well, it's not going to say it's less. It's not going to back those figures because it shows there isn't a problem. And if there isn't a problem, there's no reason for Stonewall to exist. This is like Bill Buckley of Firing Line once made the point that people use the anti-slavery league was at some stage in its lifespan effectively pro-slavery, because without slavery there'd be no anti-slavery league. Same thing with Stonewall. It says that 4 in 5 trans people who experience hate crime don't report it to the police. These are nonsense figures. They're not reported. They're not recorded. This is just hearsay, and by an organisation which has a vested interest in inflating the perception. And incidentally, hate crimes are incredibly easy to report, and they're not evidenced either. In this country, if you tell the police, I've been the victim of a hate crime, there's an app for this. It is automatically logged as a hate crime, whether or not such an incident in fact occurred, whether or not it was motivated by discrimination and hatred. There's been an incident rather little talked about where a man's dog pooed on his neighbour's lawn, and the neighbour reported it as a hate crime. The police duly took it down as one. But it's just a dog taking a dump. This is the standard of evidence we've not got. And these statistics are used to politicians call for more stringent hate crime legislation, more banning of speech, more stringent hate speech laws. On the back of this, it is madness. At this point, Channel 4 continues, we normally look to the ONS crime survey of England and Wales to get a more accurate picture. The survey asks a representative sample of the population whether they've been the victim of a crime, rather than relying on police records, and is generally preferred by statisticians for this reason. But the ONS doesn't publish specific figures on trans and non-binary victims of violent hate crime because the crime survey generates very few cases of hate crimes against transgender individuals due to a small sample size. Releasing this information could be equivalent to releasing individual personal details, which we are legally obliged not to do. So there are so few of them, it can't tell you how many there are, because there are so few of them. An epidemic of violence, ladies and gentlemen. Violence against trans people isn't confined to hate crime, Channel 4 continues, where the victim's trans status is recorded as an aggravating factor. If the Stonewall figures are reliable, it would seem trans people are at an above average risk of other types of violent crime. The charities... No. Of all the revelations to have come out about Stonewall recently, are we really going to take them seriously now? I don't think we should. And in fact, I'm not going to. I'm going to give Stonewall exactly as much time as they deserve. There are more recent articles on this point. Douglas Murray, if I can find him, has pointed out we have been fed a fake narrative on violence against trans people. The average adult, he's drawing from this... figures actually drawn from the Channel 4 report, I imagine, or perhaps it's an updated set of figures. The average adult in England and Wales is a 1 in 100,000 chance of being murdered. The average trans person is a 1 in 200,000, 1 in 500,000 chance. It's safer to be trans. He links to an article in The Critic, which is, I think, focused on the UK. Very useful article. I fully recommend it. It's by Madison Smith. It's called Neither Marginalised, Abused, Nor Vulnerable, Debunking Persistent Talking Points in the Trans Rights Campaign. And she goes through a few of the claims made by trans activists, which are just not only evidentially untrue, but obviously untrue, as in untrue to anyone who took a 2-second glance at the figures or was capable of rudimentary mathematics. She says, the people who say, politicians who will say that they're the most abused, people who say that trans people face they are uniquely victimized, uniquely abused, they face this epidemic of violence. Those claims are a shield, she writes, provided by their advisors, behind which they cower because it rarely receives pushback from informed journalists. It has the magical effect of shutting down the discussion before it even gets started. That's why politicians love it. It's the UK equivalent of thoughts and prayers, catechism recited by American politicians after every mass shooting. But there is one problem with it. It's not true, not even remotely true. The clearest indicator, she says, of the extent to which a community is marginalised and abused is the murder rate. Now, as we've already explained, the murder rate for trans people is lower than the murder rate for the general population. So the idea that trans people face an epidemic of murderous violence is flat out untrue. 8 reported murders of people who define themselves as transgender, transsexual, or cross-dressers. That's an even broader category. There are if you include transdressers and transsexuals, these are both different things. That's almost an inflated number, given that we're supposed to be talking specifically about transgender people. But even if you include all of them, since reporting began in 2008, just 8 reported murders. That includes people who've committed suicide, and people whose death was originally and erroneously treated as suspicious in the numbers for murdered victims. So, if you remove that, I mean, this organisation, Trans Respect, we quoted from earlier, says the number from 2008 to 2020 is 11, I think. So this is like, it's just, there are no words. It's ridiculous. The UK also is not a European anomaly, she continues. In Germany, there hasn't been a murder of a trans person since 2008. In 26 countries in Europe have reported no murders of trans people for the entire period where these statistics were gathered. There's been a sharp rise in the number of people who identify as transgender, but even then a trans person hasn't been murdered in the UK for 3 years. And there are, for example, no reports ever, she says, of a trans person in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland being murdered for being trans, or just being murdered generally. Moreover, she continues, not one of the 11 people Trans Respect says were murdered were killed due to transphobia. The victim in each case was typically murdered by a male sexual partner due to drugs or money issues. None were killed by a woman, and one was killed by a man who identifies as a woman. So, actually, you've got a really small chance, if you're trans, of being murdered compared to the general population. But if you extrapolate from this figure, you've got about a 1 in 11 chance of being murdered by a trans person, which is just... Obviously, that's statistical trickery. But given that that's what the trans activist movement does, if you don't like that statistical trickery, stop tricking people yourselves. According to the fact check... No, we've covered those figures. I'm not going back over those. Perhaps we can look at the number of hate crimes. She continues. True, the total number of hate crimes has soared in recent years, but this has been driven by changes to both the recording of crimes and the identification of what constitutes a hate crime. Measures of hate crime that are unaffected by changes in policing or recording methods, such as the Crime Survey of England and Wales, show a long-term decline in hate crime. For all the talk we have of hate crime and the need to compel speech or to restrict speech online, long-term decline in hate crime, none of this is needed. This is a complete... It's just false. It's just a lie. It's lies built on lies to justify more lying in the name of combating lies. It's impossible to overstate the sheer amount of... I can't swear because we'll be told off. The sheer amount of something that rhymes with cuckery that goes on with the trans activists' claim of this epidemic of violence. She continues, the hate crime rises that many politicians refer to when talking about the trans issue is due to new College of Policing guidance that arrived in 2014, which we've explained as the defining factor of whether something is measured as hate crime is the perception of the victim or any other person. As we've explained, this is nonsense, complete nonsense. Another report revealed that police officers are victims of hate crime incidents in almost half of all hate crime prosecutions are brought by the police for hate crimes against the police. This presumably includes a young man with autism who made the mistake of asking a trans-identified female police officer, are you a boy or a girl? He was convicted. You've convicted an autistic kid for asking a trans person if they're a boy or a girl. Meanwhile, you get people on the fake tolerant wing of the trans community who says, if you don't know my pronouns, just ask. Except if you're an autistic boy and actually you're talking to the wrong trans person, because if you do that, you'll be arrested and convicted. There's another teenager who asked a man to policeman, is your horse gay? Despite all this nonsense of the 5 monitored strands that the police record as hate crimes, the transgender category has every year and by some distance seen the least number of hate crimes against it. So trans people who face an epidemic of murder are less likely to be murdered than the general population. They face an epidemic of hatred and discrimination despite having the least number of hate crimes committed against them. This is opposite bland. This is through the looking glass stuff. It's like Lewis Carroll, but woke. I don't think even Lewis Carroll might have struggled with this because it's so rankly dishonest. It's not just nonsense, it's dishonest nonsense. Trans rights activists, she continues, are acutely aware of the lack of hate crime statistics to back up these repeated claims. So here, the Scottish Transgender Alliance manager at the Equality Network, that's an organisation and a job than a man that shouldn't exist, assuming it's a man, today, ask a trans person to report their claim of victimhood to the police for the simple reason that we need the stats. Please, there's not enough evidence, we need more. Please tell everyone that people are being mean to you, because there's not enough evidence of meanness. Another statistic commonly used to show the trans vulnerability of suicide rates, in particular one line often trotted out, is that 41 or even 48% of young transgender people have attempted suicide. The 41% study's authors have admitted their research was flawed, while the 48% study comes from a survey by mental health charity PACE that has also been widely debunked. In fact, its sample size alone of just 27 self-selected people meant that the Independent Press Standards Organisation had to issue a statement that journalists who repeat the statistic are misrepresenting the truth as it highlights potential editorial standards issues relating to accuracy. So another key claim is not just debated, it's debunked. It's so untrue that to repeat it, almost by definition, involves you in a lie. But you still hear it trotted out, and it's one thing for journalists to be told not to say it. Though how many, again, as a journalist, I'm pretty sure very few journalists pay too much attention to IPSO unless they're told off by IPSO. I would be surprised if many journalists are aware of this law. But that's it's just not what journalists do. But it's another thing to be so sufficiently informed that if a guest says it, you know enough to counter it. Which is why it's so often repeated by politicians, for instance, and never countered, despite it being flatly untrue, completely made up. But journalists will let this be said without challenge. And it's still, I would suspect if you polled people on it, most people would believe this statistic. Most people would have heard it at some point. Most people will think it's a genuine problem. Any one person considering suicide is one too many. Obviously, that should go without saying. But we are also dealing in the real world where people do that kind of thing. You cannot live in a world where nobody is murdered. You cannot live in a world where nobody commits suicide. The question is there an artificially high or suspiciously high rate among one particular population which indicates some specific form of hatred, prejudice, or discrimination? And the answer in this case is not only no, it's that the opposite is true. The NHS's Tavistock clinic, I've spent so long ranting I've actually forgotten her name, and I'm also losing my voice. Madison Smith continues. Let me find that paragraph again. Down here. Where are we? The trans rights activist said acutely aware. Yeah, we've done that. Lack of hate crime statistics. The NHS's Tavistock GIDS clinic, gender self-identity, gender identity disorder, whatever it is, suggested that suicidality amongst those referred to the service is extremely rare. And a study by Professor Biggs found that children with autism, depression, and anorexia are many times more likely to take their life than a child with gender identity issues. But we don't hear about a huge, well-funded campaign about prejudice against autistic or depressed or anorexic people. A US study found that LGBT children experience a higher rate of suicides from the very low base of heterosexual boys, but the biggest issue was whether they were female or not. Transgender, lesbian, and bisexual females all saw a similar rate. Again, There are certain immutable characteristics associated with your immutable biological sex, which you don't seem to be able to do away with simply by saying you're a different gender that day. Surprising. The motives of trans rights activists, she continues, in convincing the general public that transgender people are the most vulnerable demographic against all available evidence are manifold. Parents of unhappy or mentally unwell children who express questions about their gender identity will naturally take extreme measures and support flawed policies which they believe will prevent their child from taking his or her life. Opportunists, I don't know either of these people, I must say, like Owen Hercombe or Morgaine Ogre, can bamboozle the public into thinking that privileged white men are worthy of your sympathy and support. Students can pretend that women like Kathleen Stock are monsters, thereby excusing their own monstrous behaviour as they harass and terrorise them. As for politicians, it's a bluff, an easy way of pretending they have a grasp of a stance that not even its proponents understand. But its usefulness may be coming to an end, because even if journalists continue to let them get away with it, an increasingly better informed public certainly will not. I mean, I'm not sure very much else needs to be said about that, but in case you were wondering whether and how often politicians repeat things which, as we've seen, are just completely untrue. Claims about an epidemic of violence that doesn't exist, an epidemic of prejudice which doesn't exist, an epidemic of discrimination which doesn't exist, an epidemic of suicidality which doesn't exist. Despite this, and evidence of what I was saying earlier about politicians saying this and journalists not countering the point, somebody has happily, pleasantly for us put together a video.
The trans community are amongst, the most marginalised and abused communities,
But trans people are amongst the most stigmatised minorities in our society.
Trans people are some of the most discriminated against in our society today.
Trans women are more vulnerable than other women.
Trans people who also are amongst some of the most discriminated against people in this country.
Huge health problems, high suicide rate, and I think everybody ought to worry about that.
There's been an increase in rape of trans women. They are a vulnerable group of people.
That 1 out of 4 trans teenagers try and kill themselves.
The mental health implications of this debate and what it's doing to this community is really worrying. There are now members of this community actively looking to leave this country because they no longer feel safe.
Today, as we mark Transgender Day of Remembrance, we honour the memory of everyone who has tragically been killed because of who they are.
1 in 4 trans people commit suicide.
We all should discuss these issues, and we should discuss the fact that trans people face unacceptable discrimination.
The reality is that trans women are endangered rather than a danger.
You are attacking some of the most marginalised people in this country.
Tragically, police are now investigating 7 transphobic hate crimes every day. And transphobic offences have quadrupled in the last 5 years.
Research shows 84% of trans people have thought about suicide,
had their thoughts raised, and now dashed. The most vulnerable constituency we represent in this house.
That's not true.
Now, I was going to leave it at that, but there is one more thing. I know this video is already way too long, but there is one more thing I'm going to say anyway, which is to go back to the point at the beginning when I said the trans activist movement is a danger to women. I think we've evidenced that point. It's a danger to gay people because, well, that's again clearly evidenced by the number of people being referred at absurdly young ages to gender identity clinics or schools, for instance, raising the prospect of gender change without even consulting parents in Scotland, for instance, where then schools are not obliged to, and moves have been put in place to attempt to discourage schools from informing parents in certain cases. Kids who are at a young age gender non-conforming, or at least displaying non-gender conforming behaviour, who will, if left to their own devices, grow up to be gay. As Kathleen Stock, I think, no, it wasn't Kathleen Stock. Who wrote, there's a book called Trans. Don't recall the name of the author, we'll have to look that up. Helen Joyce, I think. If you leave these young kids alone, they'll just grow up to be gay. There is this movement, though, because of the increasing availability and the push for wider availability of gender changing services for ever younger people. Kids who would otherwise be gay are being funneled down a pathway which is not suited to them, which will damage them in the long term, which they will regret and which is a decision essentially being made for them by, in some cases, parents, in some cases, teachers, in some cases, activists, in some cases, doctors who are ill-informed. But all of these motivated by activists, and to the extent that this is happening, and it is, they are a threat to gay people. But I also said they're a threat to the genuine trans people as well. And I've said that a couple of times, and I don't want this video to be misinterpreted as an attack on trans people as a whole, because it isn't. As I say, I know trans people. I have friends who are trans people. I'm not straight. I think most people who aren't straight know trans people and have friends who are trans people. I know trans people who've actually gone to the lengths of having the physical process of transition, or completing the physical, or at least undertaking the physical process of transition. And I know something about what they have to go through to do that. And I have some idea of how difficult it is. I can't imagine it. I can't put myself in that position. But I have some idea of what's involved. And so I can at least imagine some of what has to be gone through. And I know that that's not easy. In fact, I know that that's difficult as hell. And I know it's not something you do as a whim or a choice. It's not a lifestyle choice that you're making. It's because you are giving expression, physical expression, to something that you deeply, sincerely, really, passionately feel. It is as natural to you to want this as it is for people to want food or water when they're thirsty. And I'm not attacking these people at all, because in many respects their forbearance in the face of what can sometimes be real hardship, necessary I think in some cases hardship, but real hardship nonetheless, their forbearance in the face of this is admirable. It takes some significant courage to do that. And there is a sense in which it does still requires some significant moral courage to speak openly or publicly about any of it. And to the extent that we define trans people by this strict category, I am all for their furtherance and the furtherance of their rights. And I would never deny them. I want them to be expanded. I want them to have exactly the same rights as I had, exactly the same rights as gay people and bisexual people, for instance, won for themselves decades ago. I want all of that. But the trans activist movement goes way beyond that. And the trans activist movement, by lying, as we have shown comprehensively that they do, by inflating statistics, by inventing hate crimes, by pretending that there are issues that face trans people that do not, all to further their own needs as political activists, really does cause and present a real danger to trans people, by and large, who want to be left alone. If there is a growing backlash against the trans activist movement, there is unfortunately a very real risk that that backlash will also encompass genuine trans people who want to be left alone, and whom these activists do not speak for. So these lies that are being repeatedly told by activists don't just threaten women, they don't just punch women, they don't just verbally threaten them, they don't just dox them, they're not just misogynists, they don't just represent a threat to gay people, they represent a threat to genuine trans people as well. And that's the purpose for making a video like this. And that's what I hope to stop. Do my small part to stop. Very small part given our average viewing figures, but my small part to stop anyway. Because we need to stop these people before they do more damage to the people they claim to represent. That claim, like every other claim they make, is a lie.